I want to bring in the former Secretary of Defense and former CIA Director Leon Panetta. And I want to play for folks who didn't hear it the first time the premise of that question to the president, which was a comment that was made by Senator Chris Murphy. Let me play that first.
I certainly worry that Prime Minister Netanyahu is watching the American election as he makes decisions about his military campaigns in the north and in Gaza. I hope this is not true, but it is certainly a possibility that the Israeli government is not going to sign any diplomatic agreement prior to the American election as a means potentially to try to influence the result.
Mr. Secretary, asked about that again. The President of the United States said, I don't know if Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, is trying to influence the election. What do you make of that response?
Well, I think the president's being very honest about just what he does and doesn't know about Netanyahu's basic direction. I think it's hard to basically, at this point in time with the crisis that's going on in the Middle East, to try to read into Netanyahu what his political efforts are all about, because he's right now, frankly, I think Israel is fighting for its survival. And that's what I think is the principal focus. We've had an awful lot of activity going on in Israel in these last few weeks. They've gone after Hezbollah in a big way. They're now involved in a ground war in Lebanon. They've had an attack from Iran that they were able to protect against. And now the issue is how Israel will strike back at Iran. I would wager that that is the principal consideration that Netanyahu is focused on right now.
We did hear the president also say, Mr. Secretary, that he thinks that the number one thing that the United States can do is to help rally the rest of the world. And he acknowledged the complications of that when you have, as he called them, irrational actors like Hezbollah and Hamas. But also he was asked about the reality of the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu has defied the administration's entreaties so many times. So realistically, where does that leave U.S. influence and Joe Biden's influence, who he says no one's better friend to Israel than I have?
Well, you know, all you have to do is look at history. In the last 70 years of wars in the Middle East, the bottom line is that Israel has never been able to achieve militarily the goals that it's been after. It's always required some kind of political settlement, some kind of diplomacy in order to resolve the issues. And I think that's true today. There's a lot going on militarily. There's a lot of action that still remains to take place. But we cannot forget, and I think President Biden is correct about this, you cannot forget the possibility that ultimately you do have to find a diplomatic resolution that can bring peace to that area. When that happens, who knows? It's difficult to achieve right now, but at some point they're going to have to focus on that.
Well, let me ask you about one of the biggest challenges right now, and we heard it from Iran's supreme leader today. He does not come out and give a sermon. He has not done it in years, and yet he did today. And among other things, he expressed solidarity with Palestinians and Hezbollah, and he says Israel won't last long. What do you read into the reality and the timing of his statement?
Well, look, the bottom line is not whether we have a wider war in the Middle East. We now have a wider war in the Middle East that's going on. And part of this is going to depend on Israel and the targets they decide to strike. They could strike at the leadership. They could strike at military targets. They could strike at energy targets. And they could strike at the nuclear targets. I mean, those are all possibilities. And which targets they strike at will tell us a lot about how Iran then responds and whether or not we get into a full-scale war in the Middle East. So, yeah, there's going to be tough talk on all sides right now. But the bottom line is going to be what happens militarily and whether or not Israel can possibly limit its response or whether it goes all out. And if it goes all out, then Iran is going to respond as well. So we are at it. We are at a moment in which we will either find a way to limit this war in the Middle East, or we will have a full-scale war on our hands.
And on that dramatic comment, I want to ask you about one more thing domestically, or go back to the president's comments about the election, because one of the questions he was asked was whether or not he's getting these briefings in anticipation of what might happen surrounding the election. You know a little bit about presidential briefings as the former CIA director. He again did say he believes the election will be free and fair, but he said, I don't know if it will be peaceful, and referenced some of the comments that Donald Trump made in the aftermath of his loss in 2020. What do you make of the president's bluntness on that front? And what is your level of comfort, do you think, with the U.S., with the intelligence community, with the security apparatus, to be able to handle, if indeed it is not a peaceful election or post-election?
Well, I have tremendous confidence in our intelligence capability and in our national security capability. I think the biggest problem here doesn't rest with intelligence. It doesn't rest with the military. It frankly rests with Donald Trump and his vice presidential candidate as to whether they're going to be big enough to accept the results of the election. And right now, both of them have made clear that they're not prepared to accept a free and fair election. And just in their words alone and their failure to admit that they would accept a free and fair election, that represents a real problem in terms of how they are going to react to the election results. That's scary.
Do you think that there has been something of a sobering effect on followers who might indeed be violent or who might be reactionary if indeed Donald Trump loses, because of what happened with the voluminous prosecutions and jail time given to January 6th rioters? Do you think there will be people who may believe, as Donald Trump has said, he believes that if he doesn't win, there's something wrong with the system, that he's been cheated, that he still believes he won in 2020. Do you think that they will have at least some sort of quieting effect, sobering effect?
God, I hope so. I hope so. January 6th was a real wake-up call. It was a wake-up call about just how fragile our democracy can be. So that ultimately it really is up to the American people. And I really do think that the vast majority of the American people don't want to see January 6th repeated again. That they want to have a free and fair election where their vote counts, and that ultimately whoever wins will not only be clear, but the opponent will admit defeat and move on. That's the way it's always worked in this country for over 200 years, except for what happened in 2020. And I don't think anybody wants to go through that again. So my hope is that deep down, the American people want to move on to the future, and move on and recognize that the strength of our democracy depends on our ability to abide by the rule of law and abide by the Constitution. I believe when it all comes home, we will stand up and do the right thing.
Former CIA Director and former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, thank you so much for watching the president with us and taking the time to speak with us. Much appreciated. Always love having you on the show.
Good to be with you.